Hey guys, this is Bluffmunkey back again with Sonic Academy, and in today's video I want to have a little chat about Apple Silicon, the new M1 chips that everybody has been talking about this past year or so. This is a bit of a belated look at these chips, but I really wanted to have one in my hands for a few weeks before I started talking about my experiences. I didn't see much point in just regurgitating other people's benchmarks. So let's get straight in. So if you have been living under a rock this past year, basically the M1 chips, the new Pro and Max chips as well, are Apple's system on a chip. It's their move away from Intel-based computers into their own ARM-based processors. And basically they have designed a system on a chip, so your CPU, GPU and memory are all residing on one chip now. Like I said, they have been out, I think it was just over a year ago the initial M1 chip was launched, but since then they have released the M1 Pro and the M1 Max as well, and there is talk of the M2 and the M4 and these chips appearing in iMacs and Mac Pros as well. For the moment, I've bought myself a basic, absolute poverty spec, coffee shop spec MacBook Air. Now these things were completely useless in terms of any kind of professional work before. They were really for messing around in TikTok, on TikTok in Starbucks before. That's all they were good for, kind of. But I've had some superb experiences with this. Well, moving away from the Intel chips, it does mean that Apple have been able to, like I said, design their own chips. And what that does is two things mainly that I can see so far is massively increases performance at the same time as reducing cost. Now, these machines before, this MacBook Air before, as I said, was completely useless in terms of, running Ableton Live or Logic or whatever it is you wanted to run. You could do it, but you hit the limitations really, really quickly. It would run out of steam really, really quickly. But that's not the experience that I've had with this MacBook Air. And I do have the absolute base model. One came up on eBay, and I thought to myself, I'm going to jump on that just to see what it's all about. I was running a Lenovo ThinkPad T480 before, which is on paper similar spec to this. It was a quad-core i5 with 8GB of RAM and a 256GB hard drive. But if I tried to run anything in Ableton Live at all, it wouldn't even run one instance of Pigments. It wouldn't run one instance of Repro, no matter what I did, without issue. Even if I used an external audio interface, it was still just, it didn't have enough grunt. This thing, however, is a monster in comparison. And it also has, what I found is the battery life on this thing is enormous. So I charge this now, my use case for it is a little bit of audio work. I do a tiny bit of video editing on it, which it can do, believe it or not. I also do, sometimes I just use it to mess around watching YouTube or something like that. A bit of social media. But even if I'm using it 3, 4, 5 hours a day, I still only have to charge it every 2 or 3 days. And if any of you have used laptops, you know that that's not usually the case. So I'm guessing I'm probably getting 12, 13 hours battery life out of it as well. So yeah, that's kind of what it means. Increased battery life, increased performance at a lower cost. And this seems to be borne by other people's experiences too. Yes, it is. Yeah, like I said, the hype surrounding M1 was that you were going to get a lot more performance for your money, and that does seem to be the case. Like I'm running the base model MacBook Air. I have a friend who's just bought a MacBook Pro, and we've been exchanging projects, very simple projects, so that we can kind of understand the metrics that we're using. Now, to give you an example, I opened up a project on this. I'm not going to use external benchmarks or artificial benchmarks because they're kind of meaningless. What I want to know is a real world use case. So I was able to open up 13 instances of Repro 1, which is a notoriously CPU hungry plugin. So what we did, we opened up as many instances as we could, and I was able to, just using core audio, no external interface, I was able to run 13 instances of Repro 1 at 5 notes of polyphony. So this is using the initialized patch, just the saw wave, running 13 instances, 5 note polyphony, constant chord. So what's that, 130, 65 notes of polyphony, is that right? Is my maths right? On a notoriously CPU hungry plugin. Now interestingly, I've got a 12 core Ryzen desktop machine here, which is my main desktop. That's where you see me record all my videos on, which managed exactly the same number of instances using my incredibly expensive RME UFX2 here interface. Really good ASIO drivers. So on that test alone, it was matching my desktop. Now, in real world use, it wouldn't, but it just shows you the kind of the grunt of this, like I said, poverty spec machine. It seems to be able to do a lot. And the other thing as well is I've just loaded up the Ableton Live demo project here. Now, I mean, I'm not screen grabbing this because it doesn't matter, but this project, which is the one that when you first install Ableton Live, I can run this project. Hello. Yeah, so I'm running that project at 128 sample buffer size. It's just using core audio, and it's showing me 15, you won't be able to see it, but it's showing me 15% CPU use. Now, interestingly, I tried the same thing on my Lenovo, which on paper should be more than enough, and it was absolutely maxing out the CPU. So a broadly similar spec PC laptop, which would have been about £800 new. My old laptop was about £800 new. This is about £1,000 new, probably slightly less actually. So not too far off in terms of price, because the Lenovo ThinkPads are professional machines. They are, you know, they're decent quality professional machines. And this absolutely blitzed it, absolutely destroyed it. So yes, the hype is warranted. We kind of have to go there, don't we? PC versus Mac. Well, I think the main issue that people have with PC, and by the way, I couldn't care less. I've run both for years now, probably nearly 10 years. I've had both PC and Macs in the studio at one point or another. This is my 4th or 5th Mac. I've had a couple of Mac Minis, MacBook Pro. I've had this. Yeah, so it's my 4th one. And I've always had a PC in the studio at the same time, so I couldn't care less which platform I use. However, I will say there's a couple of things to bear in mind when you think about the apparent cost of Macs. Now, in the case of this cheapest of the cheap MacBook Air, there's a few things I want to say. Apple screens are always fantastic, like really, really good. When you put this next to, I don't have the Lenovo anymore, but when you put them next to each other, it's like, I didn't realize how bad that Lenovo screen was. And this was a decent laptop as well. It wasn't a rubbishy laptop. The Lenovo ThinkPads are fairly well thought of, but these screens are absolutely fantastic. The other thing to consider is this is the best touchpad on any device ever. And again, these things might not seem like a big deal, but in your overall experience of something you've paid a fair chunk of money for, it does start to matter. So screen as good as it gets, touchpad as good as it gets. I'm not a fan of these flat clickety-clackety keys, but again, this is a good one. If you're going to have to use these, use an Apple one. And something else as well, the build quality. This is solid aluminium, not aluminum, aluminium. I think it's aluminium anyway, but it is metal, sharp as anything, solid as anything. And that's again what you're paying for. I sound like an Apple salesman, but I'm just trying to, again, I don't care which platform I use, but if you're concerned about why these things are more expensive, there are a few reasons why. And even something little like the speakers on this, you won't be able to pick up much from this. But these are genuinely the best speakers I've heard on any laptop, even better than the MacBook Pro I had before. And I know my mate's new MacBook Pro are even better than this. Now they're so good, they are so good that I can actually mix check on them. And in fact, that's what I do, because I've got something here which I'm doing at the moment. Another Sonic Academy project coming up, or it may be out already, I don't know. But I'm able to genuinely check the levels and the quality of a mix on these speakers. And if you're using it for audio, it's actually quite important. They are as good as a decent Bluetooth speaker, if you want something to compare with. And again, absolutely destroyed the Lenovo speakers that I had. Absolutely destroyed them. The other thing as well is that these things run so cool. There's no warmth here whatsoever. It feels like it's not doing anything. In fact, it is. It's running this project. I know my old MacBook Pro, the Intel one, if you are running any kind of audio software, this part across the top of the keyboard there was almost too hot to touch. It got so hot and the fans kicked in so hard that it was almost too hot to touch. And in terms of the instances of repro, just going back to the performance, comparing with a friend of mine who's got the MacBook Pro, which is the upgraded version of this chip, he is getting more or less double the performance that I'm getting on this. And Apple have talked about the scalability of this M1 chip, and it seems to be each iteration is twice the power of the one before. So absolutely, the hype, we're going back to the previous point, the hype is warranted. But one last point on the PC versus Mac thing, and again, I'm doing this from a completely neutral standpoint. The ability of a mobile Mac computer to operate without the need for an audio interface, core audio, is so good that, as you've seen, this is running at 15% CPU. This, if you wanted to compare your own computer and you've got Ableton Live, you know, you'll have this project on your folder somewhere. Yeah, it runs that no problem at all, without the need for an external audio interface. And almost every PC laptop that I've ever tried, there's always an issue with drivers. All the Windows drivers are nonsense. ASIO for all is absolute nonsense. You're going to be running at much higher latencies for much lower performance, and that's something to consider as well. In terms of in the studio, I couldn't care less which one I use, but I would never use a PC laptop for audio work, just because of how good core audio is. And the final thing to consider, PC versus Mac, is resale. And this is really important. So if you're thinking about, let's say you're thinking, okay, I like the look of the MacBook Pro M1 Pro. I'm thinking £2,500 off the top of my head. But what it seems that Apple have done is, in the move to the Apple Silicon, they're moving away from Intel. They've stopped stiffing you on the base spec. So it was almost always the case before that if you were looking at a machine that you wanted, you always had to upgrade it. So the price that they were quoting you wasn't the real price. It was that plus the upgrades you need to get it to absolute, lowest case requirement. But I looked at the M1 Pro, the MacBook Pro M1 Pro, and even the base model now is 16 gigabytes of RAM and 1 terabyte of hard drive space, 1 terabyte SSD. And that's probably enough for most people. I mean, if you're doing video editing, maybe not. But for you and I, if you're doing audio work, unless you're, scoring a film, 16 gigabytes is probably enough. These things are far more efficient with memory as well, people are finding. And what that means is that the resale value on your MacBook, whichever MacBook you go for, MacBook, Mac Mini, the resale is always very high. To give you an example, the last Mac I had in the studio was a Mac Mini 6-core i7, and I think it had, that had 16 gigs of RAM and a half a terabyte hard drive. Now, I bought that from Apple. I think it was an Apple refurb for £1,150. I used that for 2 years and I sold it for £900. Now, if you look at your total cost of ownership, my total cost of ownership for that machine was £250. So I had a Mac for 2 years for 250 quid. And this is pretty much equivalent across most of the Apple range, which is not something that I've ever been able to say of PCs. They do have their own resale value. But my Lenovo, give you an example, I bought it for £850, I want to say. £850 and I sold it for £350. So it's a massive chunk of your investment is gone when you buy a PC. With a Mac, you keep that for the most part. And you need to consider that. So if you're buying a MacBook Pro, M1 Pro, current price is about £2,500, $2,500, whatever it is, €2,500. Let's say for argument's sake, it's €2,500, pounds, dollars. Now, it's very, very likely that after 2 or 3 years, you're going to get £1,700, £1,800, dollars, euros back. So you have to look at your total cost of ownership over that time. And it's the same as thinking about resale value on a car. You know, if you say my car costs £50,000, if the day you buy it it's worth £25,000, you've lost a lot of money. But if after 3 years it's still worth £40,000, and some cars hold their value like that, your total cost of ownership and therefore things like lease costs will be a lot less. And that applies to Apple products as well. Okay, I realised I went a bit fanboy there. It's not intended as being a fanboy. It's just trying to point out things that are often missed when people talk about the cost of Apple products. So the question is, should you buy one now or should you wait? Well, I think for me, it depends on your use case, and it's going to be something that you have to kind of judge for yourself, and that might sound a little bit unhelpful, but one thing about the Apple Silicon is it's not compatible with Intel. So the software that was designed for Intel isn't compatible with Apple Silicon. However, Apple did create an emulation layer called Rosetta, and it seems to be, for the most part, it's pretty flawless. Now, we are slowly getting to the point now where most software, well, I wouldn't say most, a lot of the software has been recoded for Apple Silicon. The software that isn't is still working under Rosetta for the most part, but you need to check application by application. If there's something you can't get away with not using, make sure it's running either under Rosetta or whether it's running under whether it's been recoded for Apple Silicon. So that's something you'll need to check application by application. So far, I've not had any issues with anything, and I've installed most of the software that I use. One issue still is with things like Waves plugins. I think it's Waves plugins because of the iLock software running in the background, which still hasn't been converted over yet. So you'll need to check that. In terms of whether the machines are right for you, there's still a lot of speculation about where the M1 chips are headed over the next couple of years. So at the moment, you're looking at, there are M1 powered iMacs, and one thing I've noticed is Apple seem to have started with the more consumer side of things. So they started with the MacBook Air, they started with the low-end MacBook Pros, they started with kind of fashion iMacs. They had all these different color iMacs with the basic M1 chip in, and there was a basic M1 Mac Mini as well. And I think the reason they did that is that they wanted to introduce the technology without necessarily stepping on the toes of pro users. So whilst the software was making the transition from Intel-based systems to the Apple Silicon, they were keeping it with the home users for the most part. And we're now starting to see the MacBook Pro versions and Max versions. There's talk about an iMac Pro next year with an M2 chip perhaps, but this is all speculation. So really it depends on your use case. If you want something that's relatively powerful that you can do a lot of audio work on, even the Air is going to get you a long way there. The MacBook Pros will definitely get you there. You can run big projects on those. If you're doing any video editing, the jury's still out whether or not you're going to need a lot more RAM, because the M1s I think can only go up to 16 gigs maybe. Check it, don't take my word for it. The M1 Pro and Max can go up to 32 gigs, and then I think the next series of chips, I'll check this, and if I'm wrong, I'll correct myself. But the next year, the M2 and M4, which is again being speculated on, they are touted as going up to 64, 128 gigs of RAM. So if you're doing video editing or big film scores, you might need to wait, but I know most of us aren't, and if you're watching this, you're probably not. So really it depends how big a project you need to run. But in terms of having something that will do most of the things you need to do, I think the best kind of middle ground at the moment are the MacBook Pros with the M1 Pro or Max chips in. Still relatively expensive. It may be worth waiting to see where the Mac Mini goes next. If you don't need something mobile, have a look and wait, see where the Mac Minis are going, because they tend to be, for obvious reasons, the most cost-effective ways of getting into the Apple environment if you want to. Obviously you need to factor in keyboard, mouse, screen and all that kind of thing as well, but chances are you've probably got those already. So I hope you found this video useful. This is my anecdotal opinion on where we are with the M1 Silicon. I've deliberately not gone into benchmarks or anything like that, because everybody's case use is different. Benchmarks are usually relatively artificial and don't really tell you that much. So yeah, I hope you found it useful, and I'll see you soon. Cheers.